This is William and Lonsdale, a podcast about the legal ecosystem and the fascinating people and stories that make it tick. Today, your host Michael Green speaks with Her Honour Nola Karapanagiotidis. Before becoming a county court judge in 2021, Nola had a variety of experiences, beginning as an article clerk at Victorian Legal Aid all the way to the bar, with a large amount of pro bono work along the way. Interestingly, Nola is the first female Greek-Australian county court judge in Victoria. Her parents migrated from Greece in the 1960s, and on reflection, Nola can see that the sacrifices they made to create a better life for the future generation of their family came with significant expectations for her and her brother Con.
They had sacrificed so much. They were working in jobs that they did not like. It was hard work, it was thankless, it was work that they did so that they could provide for their family, that and that alone. And so with that comes a feeling of great expectation and great pressure to succeed, and no doubt they in part lived vicariously through us. They wanted their sacrifice to mean something, and I imagine that's a collective experience for many migrants who came here, who had nothing and just worked very hard to raise their children and to know that it actually means something.
Our guest this morning is Her Honour Nola Karapanagiotidis of the County Court of Victoria. Good morning, Nola.
Good morning, Michael.
Nola, I'd like to start by looking at your background. The wave of post-World War II migrants to Australia, primarily from Greece and Italy, Southern Europe, have made an enormous contribution to Australia and continue to. Your parents were such migrants. You and your brother Con were products of that whole wave of migration. So can you tell us about it? Tell us about your parents' background in Greece, where they came from, how they came to come to Australia, just to paint a bit of a picture for us.
Yeah, no, I will, Michael. Thank you. And thanks for that acknowledgement, because it's a history that I'm proud of. In terms of my parents, so my father came here, they both came here in the 60s. So Dad, 1966 on the ship, the Patris, which brought over many migrants of his generation, and my mum a bit later on, 1969. In terms of Dad, his background was one of he was Pontian Greek, or a Greek Pontian, which meant that his parents were originally from areas in Turkey and fled during the genocide that ended in the early 20s. They originally came to a town named Griavrisi, and then from there they settled in a little village called Apsalo in the northern parts of Greece. And he worked there. They did some tobacco work, so tobacco farming, fruit picking, and he had a relatively large-ish family. There were 3 sisters, so he was schooled up until primary school. He didn't quite finish it, and he worked very hard, with tobacco, with the fruit picking, and very much focused on helping provide a dowry for his sisters so that they could be married. So he had few opportunities, always was interested in education, but just didn't have the chance to pursue that or follow it up. And he ended up coming to Australia when he was in his mid-late 20s. So he did his compulsory military service for a year or so, and then I think worked on road construction for a period, then had left his parents with sufficient money, sisters were married, and he came here. The plan being, which was, as I understand it, the plan for many migrants, come to Australia, work really hard, go back. And so Mum's experience was a bit different to Dad's. She probably had greater opportunities, as I appreciate it, and she didn't quite finish high school, but she got to start it, and her parents worked potato farming, and she came from the southern part of Greece, Messini Kalamata, and she arrived. She was the last. She had a number of siblings and they had all come to Australia before her. Siblings that she hadn't really grown, much older than she was, that had left when she was about 8 or so. And again, her anticipation or expectation was she'd come here, she'd join them for a period of time. There'd be greater opportunities here. She'd work really hard and again return home. That never happened. And of course, they built a life in Australia. They came here with nothing in terms of, from a material point of view, very little, if any, English. They learnt a lot of their English in country Victoria, which was very interesting and now entertaining when I reflect upon it. And they did build, clearly, a life for themselves here, and they came to a point where they regarded Australia as their home, but there was always a lot of, I think, loss and grief because they had always wanted to go back and never did.
How did your mum and dad meet? Did they meet at a social event, or was it a love marriage, as they're called?
It was definitely not a love marriage. I'm sure they did grow to love each other. I mean, their marriage was very, and I'm not meaning, don't quite know how to put this, but it was very practical in many ways. They were focused, these people were focused on work and family, and how they met was it was effectively arranged. So my mum, when she first came here, she lived with her older brother and his family, and she worked in a factory in Brunswick. They knew of my dad, and so they effectively arranged the marriage. She met him in November, met him a couple of times thereafter, married him in January, and then moved to Mount Beauty with him, where he was working at that point in time as a tobacco farmer. And that was an enormous additional cultural shock for her. But that's how they met. So it was very much an arranged marriage. And when I reflect on that, I just think that would have been so overwhelming. I mean, it must have been for a young woman at that time, but that's how it occurred.
As an aside, I'll say it was not uncommon coming from different cultures, for arranged marriages. And I think the statistics show that arranged marriages are equally as successful or unsuccessful as supposed love marriages.
I think that's probably right, Michael. I think that is right. And like I said, I mean, they had issues in their relationship. My dad had trauma in particular from his childhood and his experiences, and that all plays out, and there's loss and grief. And I think as children of migrants, you experience that in a way as well, but they made it work. They really did, and they were determined, focused, hardworking, generous people, and they made it work.
What about your mum and driving her car? How did she manage that?
Oh, well, all right. So in Mount Beauty, as I said, it was a cultural shock for her, and just being away, she had come to Melbourne. There was a great community here. She had her siblings here. She had support networks. That didn't exist in Mount Beauty. So she was new. She was referred to and known as, my dad was Leonidas, Leo Karapanagiotidis, and she was known as Ms. Leo because they couldn't pronounce the name. But she would drive around often, and it was a small country town, and she'd often, or a couple of times at least, until it got to a point that it could no longer be tolerated, be spoken to by the local police officer and told, Ms. Leo, you've got to come in and get your licence. So she'd often drive around unlicensed until the point, I think, they did reach the point that she had to go in there and go through the formal steps.
What was life like for you and your brother Con at Mount Beauty?
Mount Beauty was and is a beautiful place. But in terms of growing up there as a child, when we did in, the late 70s and 80s, it was not a diverse community at all. There weren't many migrant families. There were a couple, Italian tobacco farmers as well. But it did not have a great diversity within the community. So that made things, frankly, difficult. And so you really felt your difference. And in my case, compounding things perhaps is my best friend was a Jehovah's Witness, and that cast her in as being somebody who was quite different as well. So it was lovely because you have the lakes and you have the beautiful surroundings, of course, but it was difficult because you did feel very different. And also Mount Beauty for us, we were always provided for as children, but it was never intended to be our home. Never. It was always, we're going to work hard and go back to Melbourne. And so we lived in a very modest house that so my parents worked on the tobacco farms. It was a house provided by their employer. So we lived in that house, and everything every year was punctuated by this hope or determination or expectation that we're going to go to Melbourne. And it got to a point, certainly as far as my mum was concerned, that she'd had enough, and it was an ultimatum by the end of it. Because my dad quite enjoyed that lifestyle. I mean, he loved the outdoors, so he loved the tobacco farming, as hard as it was, very long hours, very, very hard work, but it was more conducive to him. It's quite sad when I reflect upon it. He's passed away now, but from Mount Beauty, we came back to Melbourne and they worked in factories, enclosed, awful environments.
So, Nola, you come back to Melbourne at your mum's behest and you go to Thornbury High School, which was not one of the high-profile high schools at the time, like University High or Melbourne High, but you got yourself into Melbourne Law. Tell us about your time at Thornbury High School and the way you got yourself the marks to get into the Melbourne Law School.
I think coming from Mount Beauty to Thornbury High School for me was actually quite welcoming, first of all. There was, in terms of Thornbury High School, there are a lot of Italian students, a lot of Greek students, students from Asian backgrounds. It was much more diverse than what I'd come from. So that was really welcoming. In terms of Thornbury High School itself, there were some inspiring teachers. My English literature teacher is certainly one of them. But it was also a school that had pretty limited resources, and there were some classes that were not very well developed and some teachers that had very little control over their classrooms. And that was just the reality of it. So some really great teachers, of course. I worked hard. I studied really hard. I did the subjects that I was most interested in, and I was really focused. And I think that's really how I got the marks to get into Melbourne Law. I think I was one of 2 students to go to Melbourne University from my school, but I worked really hard. Didn't just happen for me. I put in a lot of hours.
And in being focused and putting in the hours, did you have law in mind as the course you wanted to do?
Definitely.
Why was that?
I was, from a young age, I can't even recall precisely when, always motivated to do law, and Michael always wanting to work with the community and wanting to do something meaningful in my life. That's what drove me and inspired me. And I had lots of examples. I've spoken a bit about my parents' experiences and also their later experiences in factories, which involved demoralising, exploitative work. So I saw that and saw the impact it had. And even as a young person, you have an appreciation for it. Well, I certainly believe I did. So that inspired me to want to do law. My brother, so I have an older brother, Konstantinos Karapanagiotidis, and he has always been interested in social justice issues and very community orientated and involved. And he was involved as a teenager with a number of different community organisations, and I found that really inspiring as well.
William and Lonsdale is brought to you by Green's List, one of the leading multidisciplinary barristers lists in Australia. Green's List believe in promoting conversation around the ideas and issues that shape not only our legal system, but our wider community.
In a traditional Greek household, from what you've told us, it sounds like the ostensible model was patriarchal. Really, though, your mum obviously was a very strong and powerful person. Still is, I guess. But there may have been a bias towards Con because he was the boy in his education. Was that the case? And if it was, how did you overcome it?
It was the case. It's complicated, just the way that you put it, Michael, because you're quite right. There's an ideology or belief system that was patriarchal, and yet it's as if it didn't or hadn't caught up with the reality of my household and many others, I assume. It was a matriarchal household, no doubt. My mum was and is very strong-minded, determined, resourceful woman, and she was making all the decisions. My dad worked very hard, would bring back the paycheck, but she was in charge. So there is a tension there because notwithstanding, I was encouraged to study and to do something with my life, but the focus in terms of education and the real expectation in terms of succeeding professionally was with Con, the boy in the family, the older boy in the family. And if I can just give a small trivial example of that, we were in Thornbury, as I've stated, and they renovated part of the house and our bedrooms, and Con got these inbuilt cupboards and this enormous desk attached to them. In my room, there were inbuilt cupboards about twice the size of his with a mirror, and the desk was tiny. The inbuilt desk was tiny. And by the time Year 12 came around, I actually brought in the kitchen table into my bedroom so that I could have a proper space to study. So that's just a small example. So I was always encouraged, but there were different expectations, and I can't help but have the sense that when I was growing up, certainly my parents wanted me to do really well, but the expectation might have been perhaps that I would marry a judge and not be one. I think, with all respect to them, because they were encouraging and nurturing, but certainly
and they were people of their generation and from a particular culture.
Absolutely.
So it's
How
understandable.
that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. You did a lot of work while you're studying very hard. You're also outside school hours working very hard.
I worked at a local milk bar, and then when I went to university, that's when I really commenced. I still worked, but also focused a lot on my volunteer work.
Mentioning volunteer work brings us back to your brother Con, who we've mentioned on a few occasions. He's been a big influence on you, continues to be from what you've told us.
Yeah.
So tell us about Con.
He is my best friend. He's an inspiring person. He's got an enormous heart. He's a man of great compassion and integrity. So he's really been a huge influence for me.
Has he thought of going into politics? Those qualities would be very welcome in Australian politics.
I know he's been approached before.
And Con actually founded the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre.
He did.
When did he do that?
He did that in 2001, and it was originally a school project he was teaching, and it was a project that he devised with his students to first provide material aid to asylum seekers. And from there, it has grown. It's now the largest refugee organisation, independent refugee organisation that exists here, and they're located in Footscray, this enormous, beautiful building right across the road from where it first started, in its modest beginnings.
Nola, without underplaying it, your experience is not that unusual in Australia for children of post-World War II migrants. Extremely hard-working parents and children who are then very successful. Did you feel a pressure to succeed from your parents, either overt or not overt?
I certainly felt a pressure, and probably a combination of overt and non-overt. They had sacrificed so much. They were working in jobs that they did not like. It was hard work, it was thankless, it was work that they did so that they could provide for their family, that and that alone. And so with that comes a feeling of great expectation and great pressure to succeed, and no doubt they in part lived vicariously through us. They wanted their sacrifice to mean something, and I imagine that that's a collective experience for many migrants who came here who had nothing and just worked very hard to raise their children and to know that it actually means something.
Both you and Con have got a highly developed sense of social justice, and it was shown when you were relatively young, when you were teenagers at school, etc. Have you ever reflected on that and wondered where it came from?
I think it's come from the idea of always being, I've just always been very, I don't know how this is going to sound, but aware of the community and wanting to be part of a community. I want to be included in it, and I want to help in it. So I've always been really mindful of that. In terms of where it came from, my parents worked long hours. They didn't have much formal education, so none of this was theoretical. Like their experiences we're not talking about academic descriptions or an academic expose on injustices that are occurring around the world or here. It was more so just their experiences, the day-to-day. And I think that's where it's born from for me, is just day-to-day experiences and reflections.
Well, now moving on. You finish your law degree and you do articles at Victoria Legal Aid. Did you enjoy your articles? Was it a satisfying experience?
It was. Victoria Legal Aid was a terrific place to do articles. You moved around as an articled clerk. There were two of us at that stage. We had an experience in a industrial labour law firm for a period of time. We had a regional experience, so I was placed at Broadmeadows, where I returned to because I enjoyed it so much. And again, it was quite different to the city experience, being in a suburb and feeling a bit more connected to the community that was there. So I enjoyed it. It was well supported and really well structured, and it felt right for me.
And from legal aid through to becoming a barrister is a period of 6 years or so. You have various jobs. Coburg Community Legal Centre, well, not various, maybe two, and then for Leanne Warren, a criminal law firm. How did that come about? Were these steps that you planned in anticipation of coming to the bar, or were they things that fell into your lap?
I was always motivated once I became a lawyer to come to the bar, because I thought that would be an amazing opportunity to be an advocate, to get a lot of court experience, and that was the goal. So in terms of my movement from legal aid, I was there for a couple of years, and I did spend some time in the civil division, which was really interesting as well, doing mental health review board, tribunal hearings and other different areas. Then I was at Broadmeadows for a period, and then from there I decided to leave, and I'd wanted to work in a community legal centre. I had experience in legal centres through my volunteer work, but I had never actually been employed on a day-to-day basis in one, and I just wanted to perhaps have that experience before ultimately coming to the bar. So I applied for the job there. I felt very excited about getting it and felt very good about myself until I realised, or I was told at some later stage, that I was the only applicant. But nevertheless, it was great. I was there for a short period of time. Unfortunately and very sadly, my father passed away while I was at the Coburg Community Legal Centre. It was a locum position, and that was a struggle. That was difficult in the sense that these are small legal centres and they don't have the support structures, for example, like a big organisation like Legal Aid did have. So I did struggle for that period of time, but it was overall a good, short but good experience. And from there I went to Leanne Warren and Associates. I should add there that Kelly Blair, Her Honour Judge Kelly Blair, was at Leanne Warren and Associates, and I first met Kelly at Victoria Legal Aid, and we continually kept in contact, and she encouraged me to apply to work at Leanne's, and it's through that encouragement that I did that and ultimately got the position there.
And working at Leanne Warren and Associates, what did you do? Were you a full-time solicitor preparing matters, handing them over to then briefing barristers to do the appearance work, or were you doing your own appearances?
Combination of both. So I was a solicitor advocate, which meant that I got a lot of that advocacy experience, mainly in the magistrates' court, a couple of county court opportunities, but it was mainly in the magistrates' court, along with being able to brief counsel in trial matters and indictable crime matters. So it was fantastic grounding work before coming to the bar. And Leanne Warren, she's a pioneer in many ways. She started her practice many, many years ago when it was, the law in particular was very male dominated. She herself came from fairly working class roots as well and has done extraordinarily well. And she's a very strong practitioner, and she was great to learn from.
And so it's fair to say that between her and Kelly Blair, Her Honour Judge Kelly Blair now, you had excellent mentors.
I did. Kelly Blair, excellent mentor, great friend, great examples that she was able to show me. She has has always had an amazing sense of humanity, very generous with her time, has a real respect for people, a country girl herself. She's just been a constant throughout my time at the bar, and it really does highlight, as you suggest, Michael, that it's very important. I found it very important to have strong mentors and connections and supports.
And so with what's quite a comprehensive preparation, you come to the bar. Did you hit the ground running? Were you being briefed quickly? Were you out doing the normal magistrates court thing that junior barristers do from day one?
Yeah, look, I was busy almost straight away. A lot of magistrates court appearances, a lot of running around everywhere, Frankston, Ringwood, all around. So I was busy, and I think I benefited from having been a solicitor advocate, having had connections, having had that earlier experience. It just means that you're known, and with it comes a bit more confidence as well. So I think that was a great benefit to me.
And always crime, you weren't doing other matters, administrative law matters or quasi-crime sort of things, or civil things?
No real civil things. In terms of my practice at the bar, I did do other matters. I did some tribunal work. I did a few coronial inquests as well, which I found really interesting. I also did a lot of judicial review cases, and that mainly was in the area of refugee law, legal aid, some private practitioners, but in the main, the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. And
the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre briefed directly? They didn't go through solicitors?
Well, they were the solicitor. So the ASRC has a number of different components to it, and one is a law program, which is now very well developed and has a number of lawyers as part of it. So they were the solicitor and they'd brief counsel.
As your career's developed, you are in the Benbrika case, which was a high-profile terrorism case. You, I think, were appearing for one of the accused.
Yeah.
Can you explain that case to us? And I'm interested as well, terrorism being such a controversial topic and frightening to most of us, the ideas of terrorism, is there any unease in acting for people that are accused of terrorism?
The Benbrika case was the first of its kind in terms of prosecution, and these men had been charged with principally being members of a terrorist organisation, which was not a registered one or formally structured, but the leader of it was said to have been Abdul Benbrika, the sheikh, and the men would attend classes with him, and they were mainly, including my client, young men, some might say young, impressionable men. It was a hugely interesting trial to be part of. I'd been at the bar for not that long, a few years, so it was an enormous opportunity. And it was interesting because of the issues that it did raise. I mean, what you say about the unease, I mean, it raised a number of complex issues. And on a theoretical level, if you like, community protection and the threats that potentially exist. And then it raised other issues, of course, around freedom of speech, around alienated groups who perhaps feel like their voices are not heard. It had a number of, aside from the strict legal issues, it had a number of very interesting theoretical concepts. So I found that a great opportunity, and it really involves some very interesting reflections. It also raised issues around the way in which prisoners were treated, or these prisoners were treated in custody, particularly during their transportation to the court. So Justice Bongiorno presided over the trial and had to deal with a number of those issues as well. And it showcased a number of practitioners, many of whom have become judges, who were really skilled, forceful advocates. So it was, all in all, an amazing thing to be part of and very interesting. And as you say, I mean, it's perhaps a bit too difficult to unpack in the short time that we have here, but it did raise some very interesting issues.
Was it your first Supreme Court trial as counsel on your own, not being led?
Yes.
So that would have been exciting as well.
It was, absolutely.
And a bit daunting, I assume.
Yeah, bit of both.
It raises another point. Now, as I understand it, not all of the accused were convicted.
Correct.
But your client was convicted. One of the things we haven't spoken to people about in our podcast has been the impact upon lawyers, particularly counsel, when their client gets convicted, it probably varies, I guess, from case to case, but sometimes are you shattered because you think it's unfair that your client gets convicted? You've invested so much in this matter and in this particular client that it really knocks you when the client... Does that occur?
Look, I think it, as you say, varies between case to case. I think it probably varies between practitioner to practitioner, person to person. My experience is that certainly has occurred for me. I've had cases where I have felt that devastation, and it's difficult to deal with. I mean, you get on with the next case, if I can put it bluntly, and that's what you have to do. And it's probably a good thing because you need self-preservation in this job. But you're human and you have invested a lot of time. And while I was a barrister and a lawyer, I was always very firm and strongly of the belief that boundaries are necessary, both for a number of reasons, professional boundaries, ethical boundaries, and for reasons of self-preservation. You need those there. But I also put a lot of work into what I was doing. I genuinely really enjoyed my work. I cared about what I was doing, and it did impact. And so my experience of being at the bar was that the losses could be absolutely devastating. And again, the wins and the successes are absolutely exhilarating. Not often a middle ground, I have to say. So it can be a real challenge.
But from what you're saying, maybe the best medicine for being devastated particularly is the next case.
I think that's right.
You're straight into it and you've got to put it behind you and prepare and off you go.
You do.
This is something I've thought about myself over the years as a practitioner and then as a clerk. How much investment should counsel in particular put in? Is a client better served to have a barrister who is totally committed to that client's cause and invested in it, or is it better if the counsel is a bit removed with a bit of detachment to be able to make more independent judgments, say?
I think that you need, as counsel, you absolutely need to be able to make independent judgment, and you do need those boundaries. Your client doesn't want you just to feel impassioned about their cause, for example. If I use a refugee case as an example, they don't want, while they might be grateful for your manner, for the compassion and respect that you show them, that they want an advocate, a lawyer to put forward their case. So I think that there is definitely a clear line, but I also think that it's a bit different though. Even if you have that clear line, it doesn't mean that you're not affected, or I certainly was still affected by the consequence or the decision. So I think that the clear line firmly needs to be there, and they want an advocate, and that's what you have to do, and you have to have those insights and that ability, and it shouldn't be blurred by other considerations or emotions, absolutely. But again, you invest so much, you're passionate about it, it has an impact, it has an effect.
You mentioned there, particularly happening in refugee trials, you got a lot of satisfaction out of representing an Hazara man from Afghanistan who was seeking refugee status and had every hurdle possible thrown in his way by the Commonwealth Government.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
That was one of the cases. I mean, I've represented a number of asylum seekers, and this is one case that certainly stays with me or meant a lot. It was earlier in my career as well, and I think the reasons for it are probably, there are probably a number of reasons. This was a young man from Afghanistan, as you say, Michael, who came here on boat as an unaccompanied minor, and it was an example of, first of all, the way in which resources just could be used and spent in ultimately what was, as I perceive it, a really destructive manner. And second of all, as well, this particular case reminded me and really showed me that as a legal community, we are and can be collective, and there's a lot of generosity within it. So I think I went to court for him at least on around 5 occasions in different jurisdictions. And the first one is related to his bridging visa application, and he needed to be under a certain age, under the age of 16, in order to be eligible. And what they had done, he was originally placed at Christmas Island, then the Port Hedland Detention Centre. So this boy spent years detained. And there had been some rumour going around the detention centre that he spoke a different language or may not have been who he was purporting to be, and they undertook a wrist test. And these tests, without going into the minutiae of it or the complexities of it, these tests were never used as a means of measuring chronological age, and they were also, the subgroup was a very homogenous group. It wasn't a group of, young boys from Afghanistan that had been tested and that were the representative group. But what they did is they used the results of the test to measure his chronological age, or attempt to do so, and to say that it applied to him. And therefore, he was actually not the age that he claimed to be.
Are they testing the width or the circumference of the wrist or something?
Yeah, that's right. And from that, extrapolating or making certain findings. And so ultimately, he was refused a bridging visa, and he didn't have, unlike what we have here, a birth certificate, or he wasn't even absolutely confident what his age was. I've seen many applications on behalf of people from Afghanistan whose date of birth is the 1st of the 1st, whatever the year is, the 1st of the 1st. They don't have the same systems or record keeping. And we took that to court, which brings me, though, to that point that I made about the generosity perhaps of the community. It's all pro bono, it was all pro bono, and we had a paediatric radiologist, the leading practitioner from Brisbane, who was our expert and was able to give evidence about the shortcomings of using this kind of test. Ultimately, we sought a declaration as to this young man's or boy's age, and we were successful. After that, an issue arose as to whether we then put in a High Court application, whether that was a substantive application for him to be eligible for a bridging visa. So there was another application that followed fairly soon after in the federal court. And they're just the procedural steps, and it was declared to be a substantive application. So finally, he could get a bridging visa. And then his whole case, and it was about whether he was a member of a particular social group, being a young boy in Afghanistan, vulnerable to many things. And I had, in his case, now Justice Mortimer, she appeared on one occasion. She led me. I had Julian Burnside on another occasion for the same applicant, leading me in respect of one component of his case. And I'm pleased to say that finally this young man is interstate, living in the community, stable here, contributing to the community, doing very well as I understand it. But the years that were lost in detention for a young person like that, and how devastating that would have been and harmful, and the resources that were spent and thrown away on this, it stays with me. I mean, it's a really hugely interesting area of the law. I loved my work in that area. I do. It's one thing that I do certainly miss, but I loved it because it taught me a great deal on a very general level. It was really interesting and challenging, and it also, as much as it was a privilege to work in that area, it also, just putting aside all the politics that surround it, it just exposed a system that was so stacked up against applicants. When you look at these decisions, for example, they are often at the primary stages refused on the basis of adverse credibility findings, and there just seems to be such little regard or real attention or real understanding for the effect that trauma has on people and the retelling of their stories or what's happened to them. And then add into that the fact that their stories are often captured in part by a migration agent who's got God knows how many other cases going on. And personally, I've seen a number of pro forma applications, templates used. Then add to that, you've got interpreters in the equation. And yet with all of that surrounding it, so many cases involving adverse credibility findings. I was involved in one where it was only discovered at the point of reaching court that the applicant had an acquired brain injury. How does that get lost within that system? So it was really interesting, great work, meaningful, and also exposed a lot about the real disadvantages that some people face and how the system is just not accessible for many and is actually you're doomed to fail in many respects.
Just to take a little piece out of that, how much pro bono work did you do as a barrister?
A lot. luck. I did a lot of pro bono work. I got a couple of awards recognising that, which was lovely. It fluctuated at times. I mean, I remember some weeks as a barrister where I literally had, 4 pro bono appearances that week.
You wrote no fees that week?
No, that's right. Well, I donate fees generally. And so it did fluctuate though, but I did a lot. I mean, I'd volunteer every Wednesday night at the legal clinic and would help also for a lot of that period supervise the clinic and help it run. And then I did a lot of the court work as well. So it fluctuated, but I think I've done a fair bit and I've really, really enjoyed it. And I would, if I may, recommend it to people. I mean, we have an obligation. I genuinely feel that we have an obligation as legal practitioners to serve our community, to help those who don't have, access to the legal system, who are disadvantaged, marginalised. It's just such rewarding work.
Lives in the Law is proudly sponsored by City Maps Illustrated. Their recent publication, The Melbourne Map, is a celebration of our wonderful city. This stunning, hand-drawn illustration, which took more than 3 years to create, is available as an art print, jigsaw puzzle and calendar. The perfect acquisition for your home, office or corporate gifting.
Nola, how did you become a judge? Did you apply for the position? Did you have it in your mind that you'd like to be a judge? What were the circumstances?
I didn't apply for the position, and I don't think I ever really had it in my mind that I would be a judge. And I mean, as I've described, I did enjoy my work. And throughout my work, though, I've always had a very healthy sense of self-doubt. So the reason I raise that is I don't ever think I contemplated being a judge because I just maybe didn't have that expectation of myself or didn't think that would be open to someone like me. So that may have informed the view. In terms of how it happened, it was all quite unexpected on the actual day, because I do remember receiving the phone call ascertaining my interests and effectively
You were sitting in chambers and the call came through?
No, I wasn't sitting in chambers. I'd left chambers, grieving a loss. I had a trial where it didn't go well. My client was convicted and it was upsetting. We spoke about that before, but it was one that I felt impacted on me in terms of the result. And I was walking along William Street, pushing my bike because I ride. I rode most days as a barrister, continue to ride. It's very good for one's mental health. And I was pushing my bike and there was lots of traffic and I get a phone call and I had difficulty hearing who it was, but then it became clear what it was about, and that's effectively how it happened. There was then a follow-up phone call in perhaps more conducive surroundings, but that's how it occurred. And so it was, for me, unexpected, and I'm hugely grateful for the opportunity. I really am, but I equally didn't have it as part of the trajectory or what would be open to me.
So when you receive that phone call, you basically can take no more work as a barrister?
You stop working at the time that you're at the time that it's announced, that your appointment is announced. So ours was on the 10th of August, 2021. And I say ours because it was me and 5 others. There were 6 judges. And I worked up until the 9th of August. In fact, my last appearance was in relation to a trial that I had done, and co-counsel was Judge Blair. So my last appearance was with Judge Blair, and then we were both appointed the next day.
In days gone by, Myri, and I'm reeling decades ago, there was no training. Judges basically the first day went onto the bench and maybe not doing trials, maybe doing directions hearings or something like that. What's the process now?
I think it's changed from, I'm confident it's changed from back then. There was an induction course, if you like. There were a couple of weeks of training. Obviously you bring to the bench your experience, but it's a new environment. It's a new system in many ways, given the position. So I felt that there was a good introduction, and along with that, there were 6 of us. And that has just been terrific. It's been a really supportive network.
Having spent your professional life representing people accused of crimes, refugees, basically the underdog, and being passionate about helping your clients through what often was the criminal justice system, was it hard then to sit on a bench and make judgments upon people and sentence people?
It's a different role, and it is a transition. How's it been so far? I mean, I've been sitting for over a year now. In some ways challenging, because it is. You're not the advocate for the underdog or for your client accused of crimes or for an asylum seeker or refugee. Your position is different. But having said that, you want to make the right decision, obviously. And what I want to ensure and what I hope I've been doing, what I'll strive towards doing and continuing to do is ensure that there is fairness and transparency. People have an opportunity to be heard, and that the courtroom itself is also an inclusive and respectful one. And I hope that my experiences will help me with this, in this new role.
Nola, I think you are the first female Greek-Australian judge, in Victoria at least. I'm not sure about the rest of Australia. What does your mum think about that? And what do you think your dad would think about that?
Oh, look, my mum is terribly, terribly proud. I have joked before, I joked at my welcome that any opportunity she could to tell people that both her children were lawyers, she would do so. And it is because she really is very happy and very proud of me. So she's overwhelmed. My dad, I told you, he didn't finish primary school. He worked really hard. He would have been exceptionally proud. He wasn't a very emotional man, and it was his generation. He wasn't taught that way. I remember that on getting into law at Melbourne University, I remember him giving me a huge hug, which is not usual. It's not how he expressed himself. So I'm very confident, Michael, that he would have given me a huge hug.
Nola, thank you very much for coming in this morning and sharing your story with us. It's an inspiring story and a very Australian story to listen to the generations that migrants and the vitality and the productiveness and all of the positive things that migrants bring to a community. You're a living example of it, and we have loved hearing your story. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Michael.
Show notes from today's episode can be found at greenslist.com.au/podcast. There you'll find links to things we've talked about in this episode, a transcript of the show, and some wonderful photos of our guests. If you're enjoying Lives in the Law, please tell your networks, subscribe, rate and review the show. Your host is former lawyer and Greens List clerk Michael Green. Our show is produced and edited by me, Catherine Green, mixed and mastered by Windmill Audio, and recorded by Alex McFarlane, who also wrote and performed all the music for the series. We're coming to you from the iconic Owen Dixon Chambers on the corner of William and Lonsdale Streets in our beautiful city of Melbourne. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respect to their elders past and present. There is no doubt that conversations about justice have been taking place on this land for thousands of years, and we are privileged to continue that discussion here today.